Thank you so much, Ericka.
You're welcome.
The first film, You the Better, first premiered in the New York Film Festival in '83. Do you want to tell us? So at that time, there weren't different sections, and this work of yours screened before the premiere of Godard's Passion. Mm-hmm. And do you want to tell us about how that went down?
Yeah, so the film played as a short before Godard's Passion in the Alice Tully Theater. So it was filled with the audience that had come to see Passion after Godard had sort of boycotted the festival for a number of years. And my film is a long one for a short, and so right in the middle of it, right about the time that the basketball game starts, the whole crowd broke loose. There was a rumbling going on through most of the singing in the center section, but then the crowd stood up and people were yelling and they were saying, "Get the sports off the film, off the screen. We didn't come here to watch TV." Like, okay, and then the pelleting of the playbills at me and the whole business. It was a riot, like literally kind of a. And I think the film played out, but people were walking around, standing, and not paying any attention to it. So that's how it started. It's sort of it was a kind of an oblique film. I think nobody understood that film at the time it was made, and even when I showed it around in other circles, it still really wasn't understood. Like it wasn't. But it's a strange thing to bring it back full circle because now people really understand the film. It's like it's digestible. Mm-hmm. It's comprehensible now. So it takes a while. Anyway.
Yeah, and so I wanted you to speak a bit in particular about this work and your interest in emphasizing the body and communicating through movement rather than explicitly through language with this work, and your interest in exploring like game logic and societal rules and kind of infrastructure patterns in American culture. So yeah, just your impetus and like your thinking around You the Better and how that came to be.
Well, You the Better was really a decision I made to make film. So prior to that, I was in a sort of incubation period with research, essentially, into Piaget, and what that meant was that I was trying to find a language for expressing performance in film that dealt with the film as well, meaning like double exposure, the frame rate, the use of animation, and all of the forms that the camera can make for you, and try to integrate that with performance and also with music. So music was integral to my work. I thought of lyrics, I thought of melodies, I thought of these things simultaneously with performance. And it just turned out that what sparked You the Better was in California. I saw a game played out in the desert called Highlight. It was a betting game on indigenous people of Mexico playing in a arena and being betted on by corporate, what looked like corporate businessmen. And it was a very violent game, and I thought the whole thing was like really absurd, and it moved me. And so I knew that I wanted to work with gambling because gambling also has two sort of belief systems pitted against each other. One is that you play for power, you develop a strong will, and from that will you create strategies to overcome chance as well. And then it's pitted against this idea that the lure of chance, the idea that you can you can sort of outlast chance and then win from it. So there are these two things that are pitted against each other, and gambling was the basis for holding it together. But more importantly, I think gaming for me was like a light went on when I realized that I could use game structures instead of narrative. Really. So, because we played them as kids, they're in our system, they're a basis of how we understand the world, and I felt I could avoid the use of narrative, which was very important for me because I had that choice, like many people did at that period in the 80s when the experimental world was a niche audience and women weren't really accepted in the art world or promoted as much in the art world. So it's like, do you become a feature filmmaker and use narrative or not? And I just didn't want to be a feature filmmaker with a narrative background, in structure, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And with Cinderella, I think what you're doing here is quite incredible. I mean, there's so many ways in which you're reimagining the Cinderella narrative, but in particular, I wanted to hear you talk a bit about your choice to kind of shift her context, what we originally know as like a domestic and familial space, to her being a factory worker and being part of like an assembly line. You realize that Cinderella is a game in this film, right? It's a game. It's not it's taking the Cinderella story and kind of using that as a structure to talk about other things. And so to answer your question about the impetus to use the industrial setting, it was really the idea that the forge was the first copy. The forge was the first factory, the place where the first copy was made. And since we're talking about a formation of a girl's identity and the processes by which she understands her identity formation and then the emancipation, it all had to be, for me, there was an interesting parallel between the industrial past and future and that progression. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, the dress, which is the sort of the core symbol of that film, is transformed throughout the film with her process and eventually is something that flattens out, right? It loses its dimension, its power, and it loses all of its meanings. And so this is like the copy being emptied out and then co-opted and reformed into a song or a spoken word or, her voice, her memory, her experience recorded. So that should answer that. As you were mentioning earlier, I think what's so singular about your work, and especially at this time, was that you were including so many different mediums within your practice. As you were saying, you were writing songs, creating choreography, making all of these sculptural objects that were the sets, but also kind of working in a really amazing way within the frame. Like every image has so much depth and there's so many different image modes happening. And I think this was, one of the things that is so maybe makes the work feel so relevant today, because I think this is something that a lot of artists working now are really interested in. And something that you mentioned in an interview, you said that you were interested in equivalence between a word, a graphic, and a performance. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that really resonated with me, because I think that speaks to a lot of current interests. And so I think it makes sense that it's taken this long for people to really understand your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. The films have been around the world over the last 5 years or so, and all these, there's a new attachment to the work that I never experienced before, and I'm experiencing it through other people, because obviously it's long and it's very much in my past. But the films were made totally with a playful attitude, meaning I allowed chance to enter into the process, which was very important for me, to not be tying it, totally controlling it, but allowing mistakes and things to happen and integrating that into it. So the the process of making the film was as much playful to me as it was for the participants. And when I graduated from CalArts many years ago, having come from that background where even though the school was interdisciplinary, and I spent most of my time in the music department, so I wanted very much to make a new kind of media that was based on this kind of liquidity between music and image. Mm-hmm. And which, if you do that, if you allow that to happen, then you are allowed to be abstract, all of the sort of media containers that you think about, they all disappear, they all become equivalent because they all are working with rhythm and structure and logical processes, things that composers are thinking about. That's how I thought about film, and it allowed me just to break through all that sort of genre stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's open up to some questions. Yeah, there's a mic coming.
Hi.
Thank you for your work, and I appreciate your thought process. I wanted to know, why is it that you rejected narrative?
Because I was very interested in performance, music, and animation. And I really wanted, like I said just a moment ago, I really believed, like I was a part of a group of women in the 80s who were thinking about music, performance, and vocalization as a medium. And so all I wanted to do was to take that interest and develop a visual form that is a movie, right? That is a linear event that you can watch on the screen. And so I wasn't interested at all in pursuing the type of writing that one needs to do for narrative. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hi.
I was wondering why.
Hi, Ericka. I was wondering why is like when you mention a group of women, who are these women?
Yeah. Who are the women?
Yeah, and why in You the Better, it's like a group of men.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Women. Okay. Julia Hayward, performance artist. Laurie Anderson, of course. Yvonne Rainer. Mabu Mines, the experimental theater work going on in the 80s. Michael Smith, the performance artist. I mean, the performances of Guy DeConte were very important to me that I saw in Los Angeles. Many conceptual photography, women that were doing conceptual photography with text, also important. Women who were dealing with spoken text, people like Simone Forti, Trish Brown, of course. I'm digging for those references, but the reason why I used men for the most part, and then I switched to women, was because the systems that I was dealing with were male-dominated. And I'm not talking about film culture, I'm talking about the sports, okay? The sports. And the capitalism behind the sports and You the Better. So.
Jody.
Hi.
Hi, Ericka. Thank you so much for your films.
Thank you, Jody.
I had a question about the amalgamation of your use of music and handmade materials and how you feel that it either creates a point of entry into your terms. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Should I repeat myself? Yes, please. Okay. I don't remember what I just said, so I'm going to start again. I was wondering about the amalgamation of music and handmade elements in your films, and whether you feel that this provides a point of entry for people into understanding the rigor behind your concepts, or if this sort of practice obfuscates people's perception? Because I was surprised to read in the program that someone called your films whimsical. And then you're talking about play, so I feel like maybe that's an okay word for you to describe the films,
it is,
but
very much so.
how do you see rigor functioning here?
Usually the films take, I would say, more in pre-production than production, because what I'm doing in that phase is trying to add depth and also trying to find equivalences. And so I'm searching very deep in the process, in terms of research, reading, and also a lot of like social observation, and so I'm not even going to make a film unless I feel that it has a lot of depth to it, because for me this is a way to the work, how to sustain myself with the work, because I'm not looking, when I'm making these films, or when I made these particular films, I don't have any other means of sustainability. There's not an audience, and there are just a few people, and I want them to last, and I don't mean historically. I just want to feel like I've got enough material in the work that it'll help to generate more material. The reaction of You the Better to the reaction that I got from the audience in that film screening the New York Film Festival was very hard for a 30-year-old woman when I made it, and I ended up thinking about Cinderella as a way to smooth it out, in a way to create a kind of more more accessibility into the work. But even with that desire to make a musical, and to make a musical that people understand, I wouldn't have made the film unless I could deal with the other things that I was thinking about, and to provide that depth in scope of equivalences. I want to say equivalences. They're the use of symbol that is transforming. There's a psychology behind the work, which is very deep, and it's, the film itself, again, was misunderstood when it came out, because people thought of it as a, quote, feminist film, and then there was a lot of controversy, was it or was it not, because of the way she's complicit. And so, these things that I heard that, but it wasn't my motivation for making the work. It wasn't to be a feminist at that time. It was really to get beyond all of that and to be thinking about production and how to sort of gain control, have control of one's own production. Metaphor. Okay.
Gavin.
Gavin.
This is kind of a trivial question, but how did you manage to recruit Mike Kelly for Cinderella, and what was he like to work with?
Well, Mike was a friend of mine from CalArts. When I taught there in '85, and basically, let me go back. I gave my apartment to Mike Kelly when he became a student at CalArts for MFA, and we stayed in touch. He was in an early Super 8 film of mine. He was a main character in a film called The Broken Rule that I made in 1979 in California. And we stayed in touch, and we shared work, and we developed work together after making this film. He and I made a collaborative video together called The Blind Country. And basically, we were just two artists that constantly overlapped and talked, and we shared letters and correspondences, and he brought me in to do some of his performance work when he, up in Buffalo, when he was touring as a performing artist in the 80s. So we were really tight. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great performance by Mike Kelly, don't you think? He's beautiful. He's so beautiful there. Yeah, we have a Barbara.
Oh, the work is incredible and wonderful to see again.
Thank you.
And thinking about the difference between the two films, I felt like with Cinderella, your editing tightened and you still kept the sense of repetition that we have so much in play and in pleasure. And thinking about your work today and looking at your budget from those very tiny grants that we used to get, I can't imagine that you made these films except out of sweat and love.
Yeah.
And then today, I think that I see your films in editions, in gallery spaces, and collected by collectors who collect films. And this tremendous span of change that must have come to you as a surprise, or as you were part of the pictures generation, maybe you expected to be in several spaces, both the theater and the gallery. I just wonder if you could ruminate about that.
Yeah, so I think it started with a couple of graduate students who were working in my studio, helping me produce a documentary film on the music scene in downtown New York in 1979. And while we were doing Super 8 transfers, or Super 8 digitizing Super 8, I said, well, since we have this equipment, why don't we just do a few of my films? And then it just sort of it took off. Like these younger students saw the work and started to give me the kind of feedback, like, you should get this work out here, et cetera, et cetera. There was a very sort of low period in the mid-2000s for me, and so they were very helpful, spreading the word and following suit. There were other people, mostly from Europe, young people from Europe, who took a look at the work and said, we've got to get something happening with this. So it just took off really from like I would say a 35 to 40-year-old age group that saw the work in like 2012 or so, something like that. And yeah, and so the thing is about You the Better, it is now like an edition with sculpture and an animated sculpture that goes with it. And when I went, it's not that I thought about the film differently. It's simply that I had, from the pre-production aspect of making that work, that there were notebooks and there were drawings and there were things outside the frame. And I just went back to that and I thought about those. I looked through notes and I saw many ideas about how to present the work if it were to be in a gallery. So for instance, Cinderella was, I mean, an interesting point, you know, is like Cinderella was picked up for a show at the New Museum called Damaged Goods. And I was very excited because they said do an installation. So, but what happened was that I was installing props in the window, like, of the New Museum. So there wasn't, like, I wasn't integrated into the catalog or into the show. So there were always those ideas about how to present the work outside of a theater, but to do it within the art world or to do it within the museum context, gallery context, and then that never happened. But with the upswing of younger curators and more interest in media, I was very prepared to do that. Yeah.
We can take one more question.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you just wait for
Yeah, I guess for me, like, a primary identification with the work is like the gamification of subjectivity, and how, like, today with like social media, you're constantly measured to perform or at work, and all those game structures. It's just all those, like, might have been an abstraction or so, like, real, and like the way it came at me while I was watching it is like such a playful way that let me search and find new things in my own life and my body. And so I guess I'm wondering, but at the same time, there were like highly critical things you were pointing at. How do you balance between playfulness and criticality without kind of falling into a flat didacticism?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm extremely aware now, and I think the reception of the work proves it, that, we're living in like a social gamification, right? I'm very much aware that the game strategies of like challenges, tokens, rewards, and scoring are all part of what we live with and are vying for our attention, and is trying to motivate us in production and in consumption, especially even in education. I'm totally aware of what's going on right now and the way that these films are situated in this world that way. But really, for me, I just have, when I think back in the 80s when I made these particular films, I wanted people to feel very physical, and I wanted there to be this kind of mimicry of like, I can do that, I can feel that, I've done that, I want to do that. And it's a way of trying to get into the thinking of the audience. Like, I wanted people to think, but think with their body in a way, think through the muscles in their body. And that's what I'm trying to say. Like, if you go to a dance concert, you see something spectacular, you can almost feel a memory of like when you did something like that in your past, and that's what I wanted people to feel when they watch these things. I wanted them to be motivated to change their attitude about some of these things I'm talking about. And so the way to do it, I thought, was through movement. And if you can't do it in your chair, then you can pretend you're doing it. It's really just that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ericka.